were around a couple of years ago when we came through, we had one of those real late April freezes, and we were seeing a couple of things, and we also had some of those big early April thunderstorms, and we were getting that hail damage. But if I kind of take some of this leaf material off, you guys can start to see, and you see how flexible it is now. This is what Josh was talking about in those late season kind of freezes. What we have is a really nice stalk forming, really good moisture associated with it, and it really gets bad when we're really warm. We get cold, we get warm, and we get cold again. So kind of those days where we get back up in the 60s, but we get back in the 20s, and we kind of do that. That's kind of what we're talking about on that good split stem. This is a pretty minor case, actually, and we see that the problem becomes is that if they get more split and they kind of work themselves out, this is what you get into. Once it gets good and scarred and calcified in there, we should be okay. You know, if we have a windstorm that's blowing this thing around, it's going to snap. But if you look at even as bad as it can get, we see this one here is a really large cut. This thing's still pretty firm. This is going to be supported by everything around it. Remember, canola is not like corn and sorghum and all that to where we have good spacing between it. It's really packed in there, and so we probably can get, and you see this main stem still got pretty decent production out of it. But what that definitely has done is spurred all these lateral branches to kind of push forward, of kind of almost taken that apical dominance out of that crop and said, hey, we really need to push these side branches. So in this crop, or if you have a lot of this split stem, you might get a lot more yield out of your side branches, which means you might be a little later, and that's okay. You know, especially if you have a whole consistent field. If we're working with a lot of varying maturity, that's when, you know, something like a desiccant, if you're direct harvest, or a good swathing, maybe a little later in the year is going to be what's going to even you out. But we see here, we're still got really good yield potential with how bad this looks. So we still can get really good benefit from it. So that's kind of what we wanted to make sure that we kind of saw from here. And as you go through and look at it, and I highly encourage when we do mic, this is universal. It's not like one variety. We talk a lot about where the varieties fit, and is there one that's going to give me not crud or not split or stem splitting and all that? No, I mean, they're pretty there. The environmental conditions, now we have some that have better standability, some that might stand after it a little bit better, but if you get a split stem, it's going to be fairly consistent across the board. Make sure we're putting our herbicides out timely. I know Josh talked a lot about it, but we need to make sure we're getting those herbicides out. We saw a lot of spray rigs going through canola fields with pretty yellow flowers this year. Not only are we hurting yield potential by that glyphosate actually getting out there, but rolling over that canola, you know, in peak bloom or in early bloom, that's going to also do a little bit of damage. That little bit of damage adds up. And we saw also that with our fertilizer rigs kind of going through. I know we were late. We had some weird conditions over winter, some weird rainfall patterns to where we kind of got wet and stayed wet. We just need to make sure that we're reevaluating how much that extra 50 pounds of nitrogen is going to give us versus how much we potentially will run over or go over. And if we're positive on that basis, then we're still okay. But if we're negative, then we need to make sure we're looking at that. The other thing, when we talk about Brian and the fertility program, we've worked with him a lot on reevaluating sulfur. It's one that we always talk about in canola, it being a mustard or a brassica species. You guys can smell the sulfur and how much sulfur canola needs as it's beginning to rot, and you see that, and you have that very unique decomposing smell of canola. That's those sulfur proteins being broken down and being gassed off. That's how much more sulfur that canola needs than our typical wheat crop or some of our other crops. So we are reevaluating sulfur. Historically, we found that we've had enough natural sulfur in the ground based on soil tests that we could get by without applications. Now, field to field specifics might be a little bit different, but as a state, we're typically okay on our natural sulfur levels to kind of get by. But what we're kind of seeing is in a good year like this, to where we have really rapid growth, it might be that thing that you might want to put a little AMS with that jump up or that spring up application, because we have enough sulfur, but that canola crop is growing so rapidly, it might not be able to pull in as much as it possibly needs at that very short period of time. So we are evaluating that. and looking at how sulfur applications kind of go through. Me being a cropping system specialist, one of my big things was going after canola. And I wanted to hit base on a couple of very key topics we always talk about on canola that we've kind of gone away from. Remember, we brought canola into the state for one big reason. And I think Tom Pieper said it really good in an interview, is he says it's the best herbicide you possibly could put on your ground. And it's 100% truth, right? We have so many options with canola to get some of those grassy herbicides through that we need to remember that the benefit of canola, one of those big benefits is being able to go through and clean up your ground. But the second benefit, and Josh Bashong actually saw that in his master's work, is how good it can do on those following crops. Whether it be that double crop system, soybean, cotton, going into milo. But what you can also see is how much more canola we have on this station than we did 5 years ago. That's not a mistake. We've talked and worked with Brett Carver. Pretty much all of his fields that aren't in his head rows or aren't in his breeding rows are in canola now. Why is that? Because we had a field just right down the road here to where this side was our OSU variety testing program. This side was Brett Carver's breeding program, had very similar, I think had half the same varieties as the variety testing in the breeding program. We found yields 20% to 160% higher following canola than we did following wheat. Now, a lot of that has to do with canola, but a lot of that also has to do where wheat followed wheat. We had root rot. A lot of root rot, and you guys probably saw that in the field day when you guys came to Lahoma last year, but we had a substantial amount of root rot. Guess how much root rot we had following canola? Virtually non-existent. But right across this gravel road was root rot. So we need to make sure that we're remembering where canola fits into our rotation with the economics there and everything. We also need to look at it as a system based in itself. What we've done over the last couple years is evaluate going behind double crop behind canola and going behind wheat, which is why I brought the chinch bugs up last year, because I have the same issue in those trials as going milo into no-till canola has always been an issue because of the chinch bugs. But what we see is that any of our crops that we have a non-issue with moisture, especially when we get this far west, canola is very competitive, if not outcompetes wheat as far as a double crop situation. When we're talking about milo, our yields for milo were typically 10 to 15% higher following canola than they were with wheat. One of those is as soon as I get a rainfall in June, I can start putting seed into the ground. On wheat, I'm more looking about June 15th, June 20th, 25th, 30th, you know, depending on the year, I could potentially be a lot later. Usually I could get canola with a good timely swath. I could get that out around the first week of June. So if I have a good rainfall that 1st of June, my sorghum's in the ground and off and going. The same thing goes with soybeans. If you have good long-term no-till, soybeans behind canola were really outstanding. That's when we got to start running into our sclerotinia issues. If you have a history of sclerotinia, it might kind of run into it. But our biggest thing with canola is that the residue didn't last. And so with soybeans, if we have that prolonged hot, dry period in July, typically our no-till behind the wheat did better just because it locked in that moisture. But if we have good conditions like we did 2 years ago, soybeans behind canola are just as good as they are wheat. Where we really found the benefit is how many people have tried Sesame over the last couple years. Have you ever tried it behind this crop? I highly encourage you do, okay? If you can get the volunteer canola controlled, it is the best crop to go in with Sesame. Because what we did is we actually had 15-inch canola and we put it in 15-inch right split in the canola stalks, and it was the prettiest sesame crop I've ever seen in my life. Remember, the rotational benefit behind sesame and canola is really big. What also is one of the most challenging things to do in no-till sesame is get it planted right where you want to, right? Right into good moisture, but not too deep, because you want that sesame coming out of the ground. You guys know in most of your really good planters, you can easily be able to get there. However, you get minor fluctuations. You're always worried about hairpinning, especially if you've had a moisture. we never had any hairpinning issues behind canola. We were able to move that trash directly out of the way, get it right into good soil, close those wheels back up. So once again, if you're working into sesame, talk with your Sesame dealers about potentially trying it double crop behind canola. They're a little hesitant right now. They don't like that because you have very few options to control that broadleaf of canola once you get that sesame planted. But what the value of it is substantial compared to trying to get it into wheat. Later into July is really tough, and you're talking about a really decent crop in canola as far as getting economic, and a really nice crop in sesame getting good economic returns. So what we have to do when we start integrating canola into our rotations again is start being a little inventive in how we're doing it. You know, going back to our wheat canola rotation, it's going to benefit, and we're going to see the forage benefit, we're going to see the grain benefit. But as we start seeing cotton, sesame, soybeans kind of start getting bigger and bigger into our Western production systems, remember that rotational benefit that canola has. And hopefully in the next couple years, we're working with a grower to look at the 3, 4, and 5 year rotation benefits behind canola. So just putting it in a good rotation, not having it every other year, but getting it in a good 3 to 4 year rotation is going to greatly benefit you in the long run.